General, thank you for coming back to talk to us again. There's not much happening in the world of geopolitics and risks.
Quiet these days.
Just a quiet, everyday thing. So shall we begin with the obvious one, which is Israel and Gaza, which you know and understand. There was a very good article which used a lot from you on this idea that when it comes to going through Gaza, this is a very kind of military strategy idea, but when you deal with an insurgency, you need to clear, to hold, to build. And that seems to be the area where Israel is not doing this correctly, just purely from a military point of view.
Yeah, and even the Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff reportedly in private was expressing his concerns about the lack of essentially the desired end state, something the military always wants to know. Yes. What is it you want us to achieve, Mr. President or Mr. Prime Minister? And we learned this the hard way in Iraq. The first several years we did clear and leave, or clear and hand off. And it didn't work, especially in 2006 when the cycle of violence of Sunni Shia plunged the country into an actual civil war. During that year, you know, I had two-star, three-star, four-star commands in Iraq. That was the one where I was back in the United States. We did the counterinsurgency field manual. We overhauled every aspect of preparation of our forces and leaders and equipment for deployment to Iraq. And when we went in for the surge, when the violence was at an all-time high, it was a very, very dire situation. It truly was a Sunni Shia civil war in many parts of the country. We completely reversed what we've been doing. You know, people talk about change management. You can't change any more than completely reversing. And I often would say that the surge that mattered most was not the additional 25 or 30,000 U.S. forces, as useful as those were in accelerating the implementation of the new big ideas. The surge that mattered most was the surge of ideas. And it was essentially that we're not just going to clear and leave or clear and hand off to the Iraqis who are no longer combat effective in many places. We're going to clear and hold. And you keep the people separate from, in this case, Al-Qaeda, and then you rebuild it right away. We would commit before we went into Fallujah, by the way, the third time. We hadn't worked the previous two, or Ramadi, or Baquba, or Mosul, or parts of Baghdad. We would tell the people in advance, we are going to make your lives better by getting Al-Qaeda out of your lives, and we will secure you from them. And we literally created what we called gated communities. In fact, I went to the sheikhs in Fallujah, and I said, you know, people pay a lot of money to have a gated community in Florida. We're going to give it to you free here in Fallujah. We had 12 of them. And then you have entry control points, you have biometric ID cards, you have all these tactics, techniques, and procedures to keep Al-Qaeda out of the neighborhoods after having literally gone through every single house, floor, room, and in the case of Israel, tunnel. Now, let me note that Israel, the situation they face is more difficult than Fallujah, Ramadi, and Baquba all put together because of the 350 miles of subterranean infrastructure that they have. It makes it very, very difficult because of the density of the population, the high rises, not small buildings, and so on. But the principle is still the same. You have to clear and hold and keep the enemy out of the people. And I do believe, by the way, that Hamas is the equivalent of the Islamic State. This is an irreconcilable extremist group that I believe does need to be destroyed. But how you do that matters a great deal. And I would welcome seeing a commitment that we are going to make your lives better, civilians in Gaza. The way we're going to do that is we're going to clear the enemy out of your neighborhoods. We're then going to seal off those neighborhoods and give you biometric ID cards. We're going to flood them full of humanitarian assistance. We're going to restore basic services, and we're going to aggressively rebuild all the damage that has been done in the course of this particular war. But the latter two elements of this are lacking. And so they have had to go back into Al-Shifa Hospital, which I felt they should have held on to in the first place, and turned it into a great medical center to take care of the people.
That was it. So northern Gaza would be an exact example of where they could have been.
Exactly. I've had conversations with members of the War Cabinet, and I've suggested, for example, just wall off the upper third, just to start there. Have 3 entry control points, again, biometric ID cards, clear that north really carefully, and then keep Hamas out of that area. And again, flood it with humanitarian assistance, restoration of basic services, and all the rest of that, and then show the people what it could be like. Again, they're not going to embrace the Israeli Defense Forces, but at least they shouldn't be actively opposed to them. but without that hold and then build phase and a public commitment to make life better for them and to ensure that Hamas not only will be ineffective as a combat force, but cannot reconstitute. The military definition of destroy means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. You have to focus on that without reconstitution. And during the surge in Iraq, and really for the 3.5 subsequent years, we drove violence down by nearly 90% during the surge, and then it continued to go down farther even as we were withdrawing, which showed the validity, if you will, of what it was that we were pursuing. And that, I believe, is what the model should be in this case. But as I noted, even the Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff has pretty serious reservations about the lack of these latter components and what is the future? What do they envision? It'd be ideal if there was a Palestinian government in a box that could come over from the West Bank and immediately take over. That just is not in the cards. It does not appear that there is a force in the region that is willing to go in until it has been stabilized and secured. This is very resource intensive. It's very challenging. We don't, I think foolishly in a way, don't want them to administer it, but I don't see an alternative, and I have done this for a living in two different wars.
Do you worry that behind this, and listening to you talk, is that there's a fundamental problem from the Israeli side, perhaps going all the way to Netanyahu, whereby they are unable to think of the civilian population in Gaza?
There is an issue here, and obviously the fact that there are groups that are preventing the humanitarian assistance from going into Gaza, literally ambushing trucks, gives, again, a degree of that. So I do think we have to understand the nature of the trauma, the magnitude of the trauma. I've been in Israel just, I think it was a month or so ago, spent a week there. I talked to, again, a member of the War Cabinet fairly regularly. To put this in perspective, remember the United States lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent of this for the U.S. would be 42,000 lost and another 7,000 taken hostage. You can only imagine what our reaction would have been in that case. So there is a traumatic event here, the worst in their history, and it creates challenges to distinguish between the civilians and Hamas. And yet that distinction has to be made. If you can't make that fundamental distinction, you can't arrive at the conclusion that I've discussed with you.
It seems odd to me that America, as you pointed out, they went through 9/11, and then we had these wars, which you had to tidy up some parts of it because of that, I suppose, that sense that America felt aggrieved and angry and then wanted to deal with things.
Very much so, yeah.
But when you talk to the Israelis, do they feel that at all as being coming from someone who's been through an experience somewhat similar to that?
I think this is not monolithic.
Yeah.
There are degrees of again, the sentiment and so forth. The challenge, of course, is that the ruling coalition is really anchored on the right side. Keep in mind that Bibi Netanyahu in the past has always been, he'd be on the right side of a coalition, not on the left side. And he could always say, I'd really like to do what you'd like me to do, but my left-wing members of this coalition, or the left, or further left of him at least, they won't let me do that. In this case, he's on the left side of the coalition, and of course it's the ultra right-wingers that are causing challenges in that regard in particular.
You said at the beginning that this big thing about no plan for the end. Do you think that's fair, that Israel has no idea what to do once it has done the destroy bit? And obviously you brought up the issue that the way they're doing the destroy bit makes it impossible to destroy them. But anyway, despite that, that if you were a military commander...
I don't see a midterm plan. That's even, again, you can have branches and sequels. You should have options. And actually, those exist. There's a lot of work going on by U.S. policymakers and others that are trying to come to grips with this, including folks here who are working that, other of the Gulf states, Egypt and others. So there's a lot of work going on, all of which represent options. But if you don't have the midterm, I don't know how you get to the options, because nobody wants to take over a territory that is essentially ruled by thugs right now. It's gang members and remnants of Gaza, or of Hamas. And in fact, again, the proof of what I'm saying is that not only did they have to go back into Al-Shifa, because there were hundreds had reconstituted, now they're back into northern Gaza again, which was the first focus. And lo and behold, they've discovered that there's reconstitution taking place there as well. So if you don't keep the enemy from reconstituting, if you don't keep the enemy from getting back into the population, this is going to happen endlessly. Now, you're going to grind them down because they have hermetically sealed the Gaza Strip, including now the crossing at Rafah with Egypt, of course. So they control everything that goes in, unlike in the past. But that still is an exceedingly messy situation. And again, there's an obligation to civilians that goes along with the laws of land warfare.
Do you think that if you were in the general in charge of the Israeli side, what you're basically saying, it's impossible without some kind of clear goal at the end to know what you're driving towards?
Well, again, I'd like to have a range of options toward the end, but again, you need a midterm. I think that's the challenge right now, because again, if you aren't clearing and holding, you're just going to endlessly clear and re-clear and re-clear. Again, you're driving it down, but think of the lot in life of the people during that time who are in really a very desperate situation and an enormous amount of damage and destruction.
One last thing on that. Do you still see the final end of this being a two-state solution of some sort?
I think it has to be. Again, no one has ever been able to describe any other possible solution, but obviously that has been exceedingly challenging, and not just because of the situation and the politics in Jerusalem. It's also what goes on in Ramallah. Keep in mind that they walked away from both Ehuds, Olmert and
is there any Palestinian leader you could see who would be able of uniting the Palestinians? Some people talk about Marwan Barghouti, the guy who's in jail. You look at other.
I think he polls the highest. Yes. I think actually, and then there's the former prime minister who was so impressive back in fact, when I was I think Central Command NCI director, when we would go to Ramallah. There are individuals there. Whether they can work this navigate this very difficult political milieu to get to the top, I think is in question.
One last thing, I meant to ask this before. You've watched US and Israel for a very long time within it. This is about as bad as it gets, isn't it?
Oh, no, I think I've seen
worse.
I think I have seen worse, yeah. Good, the commitment's still there. President just approved another $1 billion worth of arms and ammunition. They're trying to influence, which I don't think is entirely wrong-headed. I don't necessarily agree with some of I do think, again, Hamas, an Islamist extremist group that is irreconcilable, has to be destroyed. You can't stop short of that. My old friend Benny Gantz, former chief of staff of the IDF and also Minister of Defense, I thought put it right when he said you don't send the fire department to extinguish 80% of the blaze. You have to put it all out. The problem is they're putting it all out and then it's springing back up again because they're not keeping an eye and pressure on. Look, we learned this the hard way. Actually, Iraq learned this the hard way, because when we withdrew our final combat forces 3.5 or 5 years after the start of the surge, and the situation was quite good and their forces were quite solid, they took their eye off the Islamic State because they got preoccupied with demonstrations by the Sunnis that were brought about by needlessly sectarian policies of the prime minister. And that caused a lot of turmoil. Meanwhile, the Islamic State was able to get themselves back up off the ground, dust themselves off, go into the Syrian civil war, and eventually you have the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate anchored on Mosul and Raqqa. So you don't want that to happen.
I think we've spread enough optimism about the Middle East. We should now move on to Ukraine.
Well, one of the interesting dynamics here, keep in mind, of course, I'm chairman of the KKR Global Institute, and what we look at is geopolitics and geoeconomics. Despite all the turmoil, there's been relatively little effect on the global economy, and it's quite simply because the flow of crude, natural gas, and distillates has been largely unimpeded from the Gulf. And Iran wants to continue to be able to export its 1.5 million barrels per day of oil and distillates. And we don't want to impose, because we don't want to see the price of gasoline go up at the pump and reflect inflation in an election year. Yes. So the impact on the economy has been relatively modest. It's not if you're in Egypt's shoes and you lose 60% of the revenue through the Suez Canal, but the market long since priced in extra 10 to 14 days for that 60% of the traffic that otherwise would go there.
All the same, can we move on to Ukraine,
Sure.
which also has energy connotations? I suppose the basic question is, how bad is it at the moment? The Russians have pushed in.
Yeah.
What's the...
Well, don't you have this wonderful British term, fraught?
Yes.
I think this is a pretty fraught situation. This is a dangerous period because of the delay. There are two major factors here. First was the delay in the House of Representatives for nearly 6 months to approve the U.S. assistance. So the U.S. pipeline, which is the biggest and most important, ran dry. And it still isn't refilled. And it'll take probably 3-4 more weeks before you actually see the artillery rounds actually at the guns, or the additional air interceptors and air defense systems and so forth actually in place. And they've got to get through that. And there's a real threat right now to Kharkiv, the second largest city, which is sort of in the east. But from the north of Kharkiv, the Russians have been pushing in. And if they get to artillery range of Kharkiv, they're just going, the Russians will just obliterate that city. They have no qualms anymore.
What is artillery range, just to give a rough...
Well, you did just, again, 20-ish kilometers, but keep in mind the guns are a little bit behind the lines. It depends what caliber they are, 122 or 152 and so forth. But again, they're approaching that. They may be 10, 15 kilometers from that position. I think the Ukrainians certainly can keep them out of Kharkiv, but at some point they're going to have to push them back as they did before. In the first year of the war, they have to get them out of artillery. It's bad enough that the Russians are now using something called glide bombs, which they can loft 40 kilometers in Russian airspace, where our systems aren't reportedly being used. And they just glide them right to the, and they are very substantial in size, and they're just, again, obliterating what they hit. So that's very, very worrisome. It's also worrisome in the front lines in the Donbass, where they're using these quite a bit as well. But this is a difficult moment. It's also difficult, though, because Ukraine took a long time to sort out its conscription law.
Yeah.
Unlike in the two wars that I was privileged to command, the average age of a soldier on the front line is roughly 19 to 22. In Ukraine, it's over 40. Yeah. Because the conscription law is very different. They believe that young men should have a chance to get an education, get married, have a family, and it used to be the age of 27 was the first time they actually get conscripted. They've now reduced that to 25, but after a very emotional debate, not unlike that in our House of Representatives, and then they closed a bunch of other loopholes and other issues that they have resolved. But they've now got to start regenerating forces. And of course, despite the extraordinary leadership in Ukraine, despite the morale, the sense that they're fighting their war of independence, the innovation, they're producing tens of thousands of drones every month and iterating very rapidly. All of this, despite all of that, the objective reality here is that they are fighting for their survival against a country that has more than 3 times the population and more than 10 times the economy and is seemingly unconcerned by casualties. And that's a difficult situation.
What do you think Putin's strategy is? I mean, talking to the Polish president yesterday, it's attrition, and but is it also waiting for Donald Trump?
It could be. Again, it's not just waiting for Donald Trump. We just had a 6-month delay in the House of Representatives under Joe Biden. Of course, it's controlled by the other party. So the dynamics, they're just hoping whatever dynamics there are. By the way, the Europeans rock solid. As we were talking earlier, at Munich this year, the security conference, it was the opposite of what it normally was. Normally, the U.S. is there and they're beating up on the Europeans for being feckless and not spending 2% of GDP on defense and everything else. And this year was the complete opposite. The Europeans, robust. They committed $50 billion at the EU level aggregate. Each individual country is going in, doing bilateral security agreements and so forth, and it was the U.S. that hadn't met what clearly was its obligation. Now we have, and $61 billion is a huge amount of money. It's 20 billion, almost 20 billion more than we've provided in the first 2 years. So that'll carry this for quite a while. But there's a number of factors in here that will determine going forward, including the election in the U.S., including actually the EU election that's coming up, see what that does.
Yes.
Individual countries in the EU that are less than perfect partners, shall we say, for NATO and support for Ukraine, et cetera.
As you said, you do geoeconomics and all those things, but the other thing which is happening behind these, and we focused, I think, particularly for this audience, is interesting, all your experience in both Ukraine and Gaza, but behind it, Xi and Putin are meeting. Yeah. There is this basic issue that Russia is where it is in part because China is supporting it. What should America be doing about that?
Well, getting more serious about it. I think we have. In the meetings when Secretary Blinken was in there was no question about that. That was laid out on the table. But clearly this has built up. The sanctions evasion that's ongoing in general is very problematic. And the U.S. Treasury Department and others are trying to come to grips with this. Because clearly the components, the supply chain, this is not weapon systems from China or anything like that, but clearly it is the elements that are required for the Russian military industrial complex to get going again, because they did suffer in that first year. They were, the Ukrainians have taken out half of the entire Russian tank fleet at this point in time, and those are hard to replace. But they're able to keep up with the missiles, the Iranian-provided drones, 1 million rounds of North Korean ammunition. So it's really those 4 countries, and then a number of others on the periphery of Russia who are all of a sudden, buying 5 times as many iPhones and other devices as they used to, all of which can be useful for that military-industrial complex.
You've always been somebody who's, as well as military, hearts and minds has always been something you've really thought about. You look around the world at the moment, you talk to people here, if you go to Africa, you go around the Middle East, you go around student campuses, all these different areas, people like you, who many of us who've made the case for Ukraine, how much is what is happening in Gaza giving people, Chinese and the Russians on the one hand, on the other hand, people who just don't like America, the chance to say, look, America has double standards. It calls about liberty, freedom, human rights in one sense, and then it keeps absolutely quiet on other ones.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally buy that. I mean, obviously, there can be criticism in a variety of different ways. There is, without question. I've been the subject of some of it over the years, and you get a little bit thicker skin about that. At the end of the day, I still unabashedly believe in the United States, the principles, values, and so forth that we have held dear over the centuries, even as parties have changed and leaders have changed and all the rest of that. It's still the location in which we're investing. I am, after all, a partner in one of the world's largest investment firms. Whereas destination number 1, it's right there. And it's because there's still a very, very interesting secret sauce about the United States of America. By the way, the energy, why did the energy revolution happen in the United States? Because we invented the technology of deep directional drilling, seismic big data, and hydraulic fracturing. We have agile capital markets. We have wildcatters that could build this out. We have reasonable infrastructure to push it around, and of course, yes, we have water near the deposits. But that you see that in many different aspects. You see it in the innovation sector. You certainly see it being exported to a degree, which is great, especially, by the way, out here. There's a fantastic article today in the Times of the Post that lays out how Silicon Valley has been embracing the Gulf states. And it's because there's something special here as well.
Very quickly, as a last question, I don't think it's a question of people in any way disrespecting America's economic might, but from the point of view of rallying political support at the moment to America, what is happening in Gaza, is that making it more difficult?
Certainly, in some aspects, I think that's probably true. And again, the administration, I think, has been seeking to influence, because again, as I said, it's not just the destruction of Hamas, it's how you do that that matters. And I think the administration sees that. They're trying to influence it. It's difficult. We don't fully appreciate the trauma that Israel has experienced and so forth. We don't experience, I don't think, sufficiently the efforts to which they go to try to minimize civilian loss of life with leaflets, text messages, bullhorns, you name it. But at the end of the day, a tiny little area with nearly 2 million people being pushed around in it, that's a very, very difficult setting for this kind of operation. And again, as I said, the most fiendishly difficult urban operation since World War II.
General Petraeus, once again, it's a delight to be here. We could have talked for much longer, but we've sadly run out of time. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, John.